There's a belief within the field of Hadith that the grading method of Hadith is of utmost accuracy and gives us the correct information in regards to what the Prophet and companions have said while they were alive. We'll examine the two most authentic books of Hadith in order to analyze how accurate the science of Hadith are, as well as go through the Ilm al-Rijal science to demonstrate the inaccuracies within the corpus, God willing. Bukhari used 4 criteria to include a hadith in his authentic collection. First, every person in the chain of narrators must be deemed just. Second, each narrator must have a strong memory and be acknowledged by others for their memorization and reporting skills. Third, the chain must be uninterrupted, meaning there should be no missing narrators. The fourth criterion, which is unique to Bukhari and adds to the authenticity of his collection, is that consecutive narrators in the chain must have met each other personally. When examining this list of requirements, it appears quite strict. However, a major flaw is that these criteria focus solely on whether the narrator is of sound mind, reasonable, and has received the narration without addressing the actual content of the hadith itself. A person could meet all 4 criteria, yet still transmit teachings that are shirk, polytheism, contradict the Quran, or propagate historical inaccuracies. The criteria emphasize who is transmitting the hadith rather than the content being transmitted. Furthermore, the earliest work on Ilm al-Rijal is attributed to Ibn Sa'd, written in 845 CE. Comparing the timeline of the earliest hadith compilations with that of Ilm al-Rijal compilations reveals a significant discrepancy. When we compare the biographical works with the 6 canonical collections of hadith, Kitab al-Sittah, we find that, with the exception of Kitab al-Tabaqat al-Kabir by Ibn Sa'd, the biographical texts were compiled after the hadith collections. Notably, even Bukhari's Tariq al-Kabir was not created or utilized before his Sahih compilation. In order to demonstrate this, we will go through a pseudo-isnad cum metin analysis in order to answer the question, how long did the Prophet stay in Mecca while he was receiving divine revelation? We don't need hadith to answer this question. We have the traditional dating of the Prophet's birth at 570 CE. We also have the dating of the divine revelation commencing when he was 40, which gives us the date 610 CE. We have archaeological evidence that the migration to Medina occurred in the year 623, and that the Prophet later passed in 632. With just some simple math, we get the length of time in Mecca being 13 years while the Quran was being revealed. But when we go to the Hadith corpus to answer that question, we get a more complicated answer. As we notice here, we have chains that go back up to the companion Ibn Abbas and the Prophet's wife Aisha. Every single narration that we are looking at is considered authentic in the eyes of the Islamic tradition. But as we mentioned earlier, the traditional standards of Hadith grading check for the reliability of the individuals rather than what they transmit. The first chain starts with Ibn Abbas, then to Amr ibn Dinar, then Zakaria, then Ru, who transmits this narration to 4 people. According to this chain, the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 13 years. This matches what we got earlier without using the hadith. The next chain starts again with Ibn Abbas and goes to Abu Jamra, then Hamad, then Bishr, then Ibn Abi Umar, who transmits 13 years as well. So far, we are getting supposedly accurate narrations from the compilations of Bukhari, Muslim, and Tirmidhi. The next transmission goes from Ibn Abbas to Urwa, to Amr, to Sufyan, who transmits this narration to both Ismail and Ibn Abi Umar. Ismail transmits it further to Abu Ma'mar. Both of these narrations suffer from confusion on behalf of the narrators. When we look at the narration that Abu Ma'mar received, it reads, Amr reported, I said to Urwa, how long did Allah's apostle stay in Mecca? He said, for 10 years. I said, Ibn Abbas says that he stayed in Mecca for 13 years. The confusion occurs between Urwa and Amr. Somehow, Urwa receives a transmission from Ibn Abbas that the number is 10, but gets corrected and says it's 13. When we look at the tradition from Ibn Abi Umar, it reads, Amr reported, I said to Urwa, how long did Allah's apostle stay in Mecca? He said, for 10 years. I said, Ibn Abbas says it is some years above 10. He, Urwa, sought forgiveness for him, and said, "His statement is based on the verse of a poet, based on the narration from Ibn Abi Umar." This transmission suffered some textual corruption. The number that was supposed to be transmitted was 13, but Urwa received 10. When we go to the next group of narrations, we have chains that go through Ibn Abbas to Ammar, who transmits both to Yunus and Hamad. Yunus transmits to Yazid, who transmits to Ibn Minhal. In this narration, Ibn Abbas is recalled saying the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 15 years. This is in clear contrast with all of the other narrations reported from Ibn Abbas, and goes against the established number of years, 13, that we came up with before looking at the Hadith. When we look at the other chain from Ammar, he transmits to Hamad, to Ruh, to Ishaq, who also gets 15 years in Mecca. If we cast aside Urwa's mistake in transmission, so far we have reports of Ibn Abbas stating that the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 13 years, and other transmissions that say the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 15 years. When we go to the next chain, we get a transmission from Ibn Abbas, ʿIkrima, to Hisham, and Hisham transmits it to 3 individuals. First of these transmissions go to Ibn Abi Adi, Muhammad, and another Muhammad, who get 13 years in Mecca. Then we have Hisham to Al-Nadir, to Ahmad, who gets 13 years. Then we have Hisham to Ruh, and Ruh to Mata, who receives 13 years. In the next bundle, we have both Ibn Abbas and Aisha transmitting to Abu Salama, who transmits to Yahya, to Shayban, and then Shayban transmits it to Ubaydallah, who reports the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 10 years. Shayban transmits to Abu Nuaym that the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 10 years also. When examining these narrations side by side, we encounter 3 different durations for how long the Prophet Muhammad stayed in Mecca. Some hadith state that he was in Mecca for 10 years, others claim 13 years, and still others say 15 years. Given that there is no indication of 3 different individuals named Muhammad claiming prophethood in the early 7th century, this discrepancy suggests either textual corruption in these narrations or the presence of dishonest individuals within the chains of narration. No matter how you slice it, something went wrong that the classical hadith scholars missed. Let's analyze it. Ibn Abbas is reported to have mentioned 3 different durations for how long the Prophet stayed in Mecca: 10, 13, and 15 years. If we assume Ibn Abbas accurately answered this question, we must consider whether it is possible for him to have provided these 3 different figures. If we accept that Ibn Abbas did give 3 different answers, one might argue that he was simply rounding or estimating the duration. However, this explanation is problematic because it implies that Ibn Abbas used inconsistent rounding methods, rounding up to 15 years for some listeners and down to 10 years for others, which is illogical. Furthermore, if we adhere to the traditionalist view that lying about the Prophet earns a place in hell, based on the hadith, "Whoever lies about me has earned their spot in hell," then Ibn Abbas's transmission of 2 different false durations would condemn him according to this belief. Consequently, this would lead us to reject Ibn Abbas's hadiths, which constitute nearly 6% of the hadith corpus, due to the spread of falsehood. If this explanation is not accurate, the remaining possibility is that Ibn Abbas transmitted the duration of 13 years, and that the figures of 10 and 15 years resulted from textual corruption. Looking at the authentication of these durations, we find that Bukhari authenticates both 10 and 13 years, Muslim authenticates all 3 durations, and Tirmidhi, ironically the least authoritative of the 3, authenticates only the 13-year duration. If we focus solely on Bukhari, which is considered the most authentic hadith collection, we see that it authenticates both 10 and 13 years. Since only one of these durations is correct, Bukhari would have authenticated a falsehood, despite being the most authoritative book. The same issue applies to Sahih Muslim, which authenticates all 3 durations and thus also validates 2 falsehoods, despite being the second most authoritative collection. The authentication methods used by traditionalists, as well as the Ilm al-Rijal system, exhibit significant flaws. For instance, consider the diagram discussed in the video on apostasy. When examining Imam Dahabi's evaluation of ʿIkrima, we encounter mixed opinions on his trustworthiness. Some individuals, like Yahya, labeled ʿIkrima as a liar, while others, such as Ayub, defended his honesty. Similarly, Ibn Sirin also considered ʿIkrima a liar, and Imam Malik generally avoided accepting his hadiths, except in certain cases. The same mixed evaluations apply to Muslim's collection, but Bukhari's stance is different. Bukhari asserts that no companion disputes the reliability of ʿIkrima. Given the contradictory testimonies from others, Bukhari's claim appears false. There are only two possibilities. Either ʿIkrima is trustworthy or he is not. The lack of a clear consensus on ʿIkrima's reliability is concerning. Despite being cited as an authority and transmitting hadiths from the companion Ibn Abbas, reliable sources accuse him of dishonesty. This discrepancy highlights the inherent subjectivity and questionable nature of the sciences of hadith. For a deeper critique of the Ilm al-Rijal system, I recommend watching Quran Talk's video titled Circular Logic of Hadith Biographies, Ilm al-Rijal, linked in the description below. The notion that the hadith sciences and classical Islamic scholars have developed a flawless system for determining the Prophet's sayings is fundamentally flawed. This belief stems from an uncritical adherence to the traditions of earlier generations, rather than rigorous, objective analysis. The hadith corpus contains numerous dubious narrations that were unfortunately authenticated by scholars like Bukhari and Muslim. For instance, consider the following hadiths. He who eats 7 ajwa dates every morning will not be affected by poison or magic on that day. There is healing in black cumin for all diseases except death. The consent of a virgin is her silence. Women are bad omens, and newborn girls buried alive are going to hell. These examples reflect serious issues within the hadith corpus, which includes false and questionable narrations. An entire Git book of such narrations is provided in the description below for further reference. The reality is that the so-called authentic hadith collections contain inaccuracies and falsehoods. The traditionalist scholars' methodologies, inherited from previous generations, fall drastically short of providing an accurate representation of Islamic teachings. This has led to divergent beliefs and sects within the religion, contrary to the Quran's condemnation of division. As the Quran states, God cites the example of a man who deals with disputing partners, hadith, compared to a man who deals with only one consistent source, Quran. Are they the same? Praise be to God, most of them do not know. This verse underscores the inadequacy of relying on conflicting hadith sources compared to the consistency of the Quran. This channel is dedicated to critically assessing these narrations in order to find the underlying motivations, potential truths and influences underneath it all. I hope you stay for the ride. That will be the end of the video. If you enjoyed, please press the like button and subscribe. Join the Discord server linked below to discuss with like-minded people. Peace.
I'm not positive, but if I'm not mistaken, it has something to do with like
How? 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 I don't know. I don't know.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility.